and welcome to another episode of Captive Minds. I am Shaenah Batterson, and I'll be your host today. Also, before I forget, I'm going to credit the song for the montage, which was The First 5 Minutes After Death by Coil. With me is my co-host and comrade, Max Perry. Hi, Max.
Hey everyone, good to be with you for another episode. Hello, Shaenah. And yeah, please don't sue us, Coil, for using the song.
Um, Max is an independent journalist who is syndicated at Covert Action magazine. I suggest everyone go out and check out his fantastic work. This episode, we're going to get a bit esoteric. We're going to discuss some surrealists and surrealist affiliated artists, their politics, and their interest in the occult for the purpose of enriching their creative practice. Also, we'll get into a group who was quite the opposite of the surrealists, yet who also had an interest in the occult, namely the Nazis. So I'd like to start off talking a bit about Frida Kahlo, since I see her self-portraits on bags, cups, stickers, and pretty much any other surface these days. And also since I'm an admirer of Frida as well. I would say that her art and even her life story to a degree are pretty ubiquitous today. Her politics aren't often discussed in mainstream circles, at least not that I'm aware of. Frida Kahlo was, for much of her life, a committed communist. She joined the Mexican Communist Party in her 20s, but she left when her husband, the odious and abusive Diego Rivera, was expelled. Kahlo and Rivera then went to the United States and began to associate themselves with the Trotskyist movement there. In 1937, Trotsky and Kahlo met in Mexico. He was on the run from the Soviet government. Max, can you tell us a bit about Frida and Trotsky's affair as well as his ensuing assassination?
Well, yeah, I mean, well, first of all, it's kind of debated whether or not Frida Kahlo was a surrealist, and I know that she herself rejected that category, but I've always considered her one. I know a lot of some art critics do. I mean, I think if you look at her work in comparison to like the other Mexican muralists, like her husband Rivera, and also Orozco, and even David Alfaro Siqueiros, I think that her work is a lot more fantastical with like dreamlike elements and a self-reflexivity. And, I mean, she's definitely considered a magical realist. Whether or not her work falls into the category of surrealism is debatable, but I think it does. And I think you're right to say that her work has really been um, subsequently depoliticized, and so much of the focus these days is on like her personal identity and her sexuality, because of things that came out, I guess, in her diaries. I mean, I mean, she didn't really consider it a big deal, her bisexuality. But in the years since, she's this LGBT icon. But I'm not so sure how much of that she really wanted to be made public. And she's been turned into this sexual liberation symbol, um, which isn't necessarily a problem. But when you consider that her communist politics, and specifically the particular kind of communist politics that she espoused, it's really kind of been evacuated from her legacy in many respects, and she's her image is being used to sell products, and she's just known as this fashion icon, which she was. She was a pioneer of style in many respects, but she was also emulating you know the indigenous in many respects, and I think that she would have said that herself. But yeah, I mean, everyone knows the story that she had an affair with Trotsky. I mean, it's important to note that that affair only lasted a few months. Um, and the Spanish Civil War was the backdrop to that. Mexico, along with the USSR, was one of the few countries to support the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. Um, and but by 1939, she and Diego Rivera had both switched allegiances to the Comintern in the Stalinist camp. And Trotsky had made a lot of political enemies by that point, and I know that he and Rivera had a falling out, I think, over the 1940 election in Mexico to replace the president who had given Trotsky asylum. I think his name was Cardenas. Um, and, you know, uh, Rivera, Frida Kahlo and Trotsky had this, brief affair, and, he was cheating on his wife with her. And I think his wife gave him a ultimatum over it. And so they had a falling out politically. And I know that Trotsky had tried to write to her and reconcile, but she gave him the cold shoulder. Meanwhile, David Alfaro Siqueiros, who was always in the Stalinist camp, he had volunteered and gone over to fight in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side. And over there, the Trotskyists had really been disruptive of the Popular Front that they had tried to form against Franco, and were along with the anarchists. They were really disrupting the war effort there, and so the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, they had really started infiltrating the Trotskyist movement, both in Europe and in Mexico. And Siqueiros, at some point while he was fighting over in the Spanish Civil War, was, I guess, recruited by the NKVD. And I mean, I think Siqueiros is a totally visionary, brilliant artist. I mean, he's one of my favorites. I always preferred his. I mean, I like Diego Rivera and Orozco and Frida Kahlo as well, but I always considered Siqueiros to be the most brilliant of all of them. But yeah, at some point he was recruited, and when he got back to Mexico, he tried to kill Trotsky. He tried to assassinate him. I think he like threw a bomb or something in his home with some other people. I'm not sure the whole details, but Trotsky survived that attempt, and eventually this Spaniard who'd been recruited by the NKVD named Ramon Mercader had posed as like a Canadian journalist and gone to Mexico. And Trotsky was under the impression that he was like a sympathizer, a Trotskyist, or that he was a Trotskyist. And so he worked his way into Trotsky's inner circle, and then subsequently, famously killed him with an ice axe upside the head, which was very brutal killing. And it came out, Frida was detained, well, I think along with her sister, for 2 days after the murder happened, and by Mexican police. And she was found to not be involved, but it came out later that she had apparently, in some circumstance, met Ramon Mercader when she was in Paris the previous year. And, even though she'd done this while she was still, comrades with Trotsky, she'd done that self-portrait tribute to him. But after his murder, I mean, in her diary entries, she's very, and passages, she's in her writing, she was always very open. She very much, along with Rivera, became a Marxist-Leninist. And she later on, after, I believe her last painting was a self-portrait with a picture of Stalin behind her, and Stalin is kind of like his eyes are kind of like towards the point of view of the picture. And like a lot of biographers now, like if you go on like fridakahlo.org, they try and say that it was like it was meant to depict Stalin in a nefarious way, but it really doesn't read like that. And to me, it's clearly a sign of admiration. And she had praised him in her diary, and you know, by the time of her death, she was clearly a Marxist-Leninist, and so there's been a lot of historical revisionism regarding that. But I mean, it's possible that she was involved somehow in Trotsky's murder. But either way, yeah, that was the circumstance. I mean, her politics have really been kind of sanitized, and I just knowing her, I mean, she was a very uncompromising figure, and I think that she really would resent a lot of the way that her image had been used, you know, and and you know, I just I find the way that she's been kind of exploited and used to sell products and just become this symbol of like identity politics, while her Marxism has kind of been pushed aside. So, but yeah, even the particular kinds of, I mean, it's well known that she was a communist, but even the particular kind of Marxism that she espoused has been sort of historically altered in my view.
Yeah, I saw that doing research saying that the picture she painted of herself with Stalin was somehow a criticism, or it was just that she just sort of lost her mind and wasn't in her right mind. Yet, in my view, with the way the picture looks, I think that she was probably trying to demonstrate her commitment to actually existing socialism, since at that time Stalin had been the longest lasting and main leader of the world's largest socialist country. I mean, Frida Kahlo remained committed to the cause of working class revolution until her death. She even painted a hammer and sickle on two of the orthopedic corsets she had to wear from her back injury, which I have a picture to share.
That was a big issue for her. I know was the injury she suffered when she was young that really impacted her life. Um, but yeah, she was very much a committed communist, and yeah, that I think that aspect of her work has really been uh, just kind of left out to many respects, and in many respects. And as far as whether she was a surrealist or not, I do think that she qualifies, because if you look at her work, I mean, just the even like some of the anthropomorphic stuff, and the incorporation of the natural world. And I mean, I know that she personally didn't identify with that movement or consider herself a part of it, but there was a lot of artists working at the time who didn't necessarily weren't necessarily part of the officially part of the group, but they were doing stuff that was that had overlap stylistically in terms of like pushing the boundaries. um and I certainly think that she was in that milieu.
Yeah, I agree. I think, well, I think that she was kind of resentful of Breton branding her a surrealist without her concession to it. And because at that time, surrealism was this Western European
Hmm.
phenomenon. Yeah, in regards to her politics, has really been erased. I know in 1954, 1954, she painted a political painting entitled "Marxism Will Give Health to the Sick," which originally the title she had for it was "Peace on Earth, so the Marxist science may save the sick and those oppressed by criminal Yankee capitalism." And if you look, there are quite a few of her paintings with the imagery itself and then the titles, which are criticizing US imperialism and sort of the way the United States was and is.
Yeah, yeah, I think uh as far I'm not super aware of her exchanges with Breton, but like the surrealists, their politics were um their political affiliations were, I think, a lot less explicitly Marxist. I mean, most of them identified as communists or anarchists, um, but their relationship, I mean, with them was kind of it fluctuated. And also, I mean, when the war broke out, most all of them fled to the West, which is important, while other people stayed, famously like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, they stayed, and the Surrealists, including Max Ernst and numerous other people, they came to the West and even went out to California. It was their political commitments were, it's sort of like their relationship with Freud. I mean, Freud did not consider, even though their art was very much inspired by his discoveries of the unconscious mind. He did not consider them his pupils, and even though he was like the patron saint of surrealism in many respects, um, he never really saw it that way. And so I think that their relationship with Marxism was always kind of similar, because even somebody like Rene Magritte, who was a communist his whole life, um, I think that he was sort of at odds with, I mean, he was always a member of the Communist Party, but I think he had a view of art that it should be autonomous. And I think most of the surrealists sort of had a, you know, um, uncomfortable relationship, maybe, in terms of with how communism, the debate surrounding the nature of art, whether it should be didactic or ex, you know, uh, whether they should service themselves uh, for submit to propaganda, to stop the rise of things like fascism. But yeah, Frida Kahlo, I think, was much more militantly Marxist than than the European surrealists, for sure.
Move on to the only, and practically the only surrealist that moved to the right. Um, I'm talking about Salvador Dali, who, I've always really liked his art. He, to a lot of his best work came from doing what he called his paranoiac critical method, which consisted of him working himself up into a paranoid state where he would persuade himself to see other objects and images in mundane objects, thus stripping objective reality of its stability and meaning. I mean, to me, perhaps some of this mentality is what led to his um, problems.
Well, I mean, I know he claimed to be a communist, or he was actively a communist very early on in his life. But yeah, when the Spanish Civil War broke out, Dali famously found himself at odds by staying neutral during the conflict. And then after the war was over, he had several correspondences with with them, and basically it seemingly endorsed some of the racism. I mean, he also clearly had a fascination with Hitler and Nazism that even took on like a sexual nature at times. I mean, he did that painting, The Enigma of Hitler, which got him a lot of criticism from his peers. But like I said, in correspondences with Breton, he seemingly embraced some of the racism, I think, which was the final straw for him as a member of the Surrealist movement. And, he always kind of, I mean, he was a narcissist, and, he kind of differentiated himself or distinguished himself from them by sort of always openly seeking fame and wealth. He was very fond of the aristocracy. I know he was friends with Wallis Simpson, who herself was accused of Nazi sympathies, which brought great scandal to the British royal family. It was what caused Edward VIII to abdicate the throne. Um, And, he, I mean, I know that, while he's during the Spanish Civil War, while he's refraining from commenting on the war and maintaining this neutral stance, you've got artists like Picasso, painting Guernica. But, after Franco and the Phalangists won, he wrote to the director, Louis Buñuel, whom he previously collaborated with on the silent film Un Chien Andalou, that he rejected Marxism and socialism, unlike the other surrealists, and that he said he was a Catholic and he supported Franco. And I think at that point Buñuel was like, I don't want anything to do with you, and broke from him. But Breton kicked him out of the surrealist group, not just for political reasons, for his fascist sympathies, um, or his public antics, really. But even artistically, like you were talking about his paranoid critical method. I mean, even his techniques were kind of a departure from um, the other surrealists in terms of like, the other surrealists had what they called automatism. Um, like, and in Breton's case, someone like him, it was automatic writing, or transcribing. You know, it was an attempt to transcribe your thought, um, from your unconscious mind, totally stripped of interference or control by reason. Um, and they also had automatic drawing methods, which was, people like Austin Osman Spare and uh, other uh, illustrators that they did automatic drawing. It was the same thing. It was an attempt to channel your unconscious onto the canvas or on paper, without the interference of reason, and to go beyond, you know, conventions of beauty, or artistic conventions, aesthetic conventions, even any moral considerations. That's what their methods were about. And although he was also trying to channel the unconscious, I think that his method was not, as spontaneous and passive in trying to unlock the unconscious mind. Dali kind of rejected that in favor of his own method, um, where he was trying to, you know, uh, induce paranoid states. I think he would do stuff like stand on his head, uh, all kinds of stuff, and to do these like visual tricks that were, similarly inspired by Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis. Um, but he was trying to do these visual tricks or techniques that were, like he would paint a bunch of objects that would make up a face, as an example. So you would be looking at one thing, but you'd be experiencing or seeing another. But it was very, conscious, whereas the automatic drawing or the automatic writing, the automatism, was very spontaneous and passive. Um, and he was Dali was very, uh, he kind of became kind of a self-parody later on. I mean, he had really adopted this um, narcissistic, persona and alter ego, where he went on to do advertisements and, selling stuff, and he became like this brand. And he was always putting on a show. I mean, even I remember in film school we had to watch Andy Warhol screen tests, which I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they were like, I was never an admirer of Warhol. But the one thing he did do that was kind of interesting in his film work was these screen tests where, he would record with a stationary camera, various, celebrities that were in his factory or came to visit his factory. But it was silent, so Warhol's behind the camera and you wouldn't hear what he was saying to his subjects. And it was kind of interesting because it was like just a stationary camera, like probing the face of these people, and you would almost kind of see their inner psychology. It kind of was like, it was supposed to make you think about the whole nature of photography or film and what it is to look at something. And but with Dali, he sits down in front of the camera and he's just like totally cocksure and arrogant and doing all these faces. And then at some point, like I remember, like Warhol, uh, I don't know if he did this while he was shooting or in post, but like the image gets flipped, so Dali is upside down. But like Dali, by the end, he's like kind of breaking down, and he's like clearly like psychologically, um, he almost looks like he's on the verge of tears. Um, and I think it kind of revealed a lot about him that he was always putting on this front. Um, and but as far as like his politics, I mean, he was really always reactionary. I mean, I know he first got into or started to butt heads with the other surrealists when he did a painting called Enigma of William Tell, that I guess was supposed to be Lenin. It doesn't really look like Lenin, but I guess it was supposed to be him. And it's like this distorted image, but it's like this sort of figure who's stripped naked down, and he's bare-assed, and then but his figure is like his behind is almost stretched, almost like a horse or something. And almost, and the way that Dali put it was that he was bare-assed and stretched like a breakfast roll. And he said that's how he felt about the Russian Revolution. Um, which obviously this, this obviously offended the other surrealists. But
Yeah,
I mean, so much of him was clearly about being a provocateur. But I don't think it's purely that. I mean, clearly he did have very right-wing politics as visionary as he and brilliant as he was, um, especially in the beginning.
yeah, I think Breton at one point nicknamed Dali Avita Dollars because
Yeah.
of his eagerness for money and fame. And I mean, if you look, there are a lot of sort of you can see in a lot of his artwork some like sexual fixations and other mental instabilities, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he, yeah, there was a certain kind of megalomania about him. I don't know how much of his insanity was really a put on or not, but I think he was clearly very much interested in pushing people's buttons and selling himself. Um, and I think whoever he was just kind of got lost in that, but he definitely had fascist sympathies. And it's a shame because in the beginning his paintings really were quite visionary. And but it just kind of goes to show like how as an artistic movement, I think the surrealists, um like what I was saying before about the Freudian influence, and also there was sort of an internal contradiction between what they were trying to do artistically and some of them professing or affiliated with Marxism, because so much of what they were doing was like a reaction to um or a critique of like reason. And they saw, like for example, Max Ernst had fought in the First World War, and you know, they the modern world was very uh, was seeing unprecedented carnage, and there was the chaos of the modern world, and they saw you know reason and rationality as like a failure, and that it wasn't preventing things like this totally meaningless war where millions of people had been sent off to die. for imperialist profit. And they were, someone like Max Ernst, it started with like the Dada movement, where it was, they were interested in violating like all taboos and uh, with their methods, doing things like the collage. I mean, that was seen as like, now it's something like that is so you don't think twice about it. But at the time, it was very controversial. Their methods of cutting up things and um, even the methods that he was doing, like you know, uh, tracing over things with charcoal, to get the texture of something, frottage and grattage, the same thing with paint on a canvas over the surfaces of things to get their texture. That was all groundbreaking at the time. But I think that their relationship with Marxism or politics was always kind of uneasy, because their artistic project was sort of always very libertine. I mean, if you look at the people that they were, um, they admired, was people like uh, Marquis de Sade, for one, who was very, in his day, they saw him as, this figure that was defying all moral conventions and social taboos, and that was one of their influences. And I think, they were also admirers of people like the Comte de la Traiemont, if I'm saying it correctly, who did the book Songs of Maldor, Les Chants de Maldor, um, which Breton on the back describes as the expression of a revelation so complete it seems to exceed human potential. And they saw in the unconscious mind that's what reality really was, and they were trying to channel that in their art. Hence surreality, you know, to make a new reality out of that. Um, so much what they were trying to do in terms of being transgressive, I think, kind of made their political affiliations kind of uneasy. But and again, like uh they also, which with this episode we wanted to get into, is that also they were very much influenced by the occult as well. Um, some of them more than others, um, but there was an interest there, and it sort of, you know, there was a big wave across Europe at the time in reaction to not just World War One, but like um, the Industrial Revolution and the advent of capitalism. It had created this new class of industrialists and financiers, um, and science. The advent of science was um, undermining sacred belief systems, um, and you had in the cities the working classes toiling away in factories and the industrial proletariat, and artisans, were having to give up their trades because everything has been replaced by mass production. And so you get a widespread interest in things like the occult, especially among like the aristocracy. And that's where the influence of the occult on the Nazis comes in. Well, we'll get into that later. But I think it's sort of similar because, the I think that the surrealists, a lot of them identified with somebody like uh, Marquis de Sade, because he was sort of like a class traitor of his day towards the aristocracy, but they were sort of like class traitors to the bourgeoisie. I mean, that's why I've seen people like art critics like Robert Hughes put it in he has a great series on, or he did a great series for the BBC, I believe, on modern art called The Shock of the New. And the episode on surrealism, that's sort of where the way he describes their influence from from people like Desaad, but also their interest in the occult was, I think, sort of, although in the way it played out in their art, it was very symbolic and metaphorical. I think that there was sort of like an interest in it because science and reason was seen as like this big failure, and so they wanted to go back to things like alchemy and magic and to search for real, truth and reality and a new way of doing things. I mean, um, yeah, it's
Yeah,
complicated, but I think that's where that comes in, the interest.
those are
Oh,
those are some good points. And I believe that Breton, he didn't advocate for actually practicing the occult. It was more about the visual symbology of it. But I think it's interesting to situate surrealism at the time when it arose, because I know Breton also, I believe, was he I can't remember if he was a soldier. I feel like he worked as a psychiatric doctor in World War One. I can't remember which, but he was close to the war. And I think that that time between the two world wars, because the First World War was such a earth-shattering thing for so many people, was and mass destruction
hmm.
and killing on a scale never before seen. Surrealism as an art form, it's sort of like a traumatized rupture with reality. And
Yeah.
as in regards their um fixation with Marquis de Sade, that actually caused a split and alienated a lot of the women artists from the Surrealists, because some of them really didn't like Marquis de Sade, which is talked about in this book, Women Artists and the Surrealist Movement by Whitney Chadwick, which is really good and covers a lot of different artists. But Remedios Varo and Leonora Carrington, I um both of them were affiliated with the Surrealist movement, but they weren't, or at least weren't officially part of the group. They both strongly incorporated the occult into their artistic practices, but they also practiced the occult just in their lives in general. Leonora Carrington was married to Max Ernst prior to World War II. When the war broke out, Ernst was imprisoned in a concentration camp, and Carrington ended up having a mental breakdown shortly afterwards. She was institutionalized, I think, her at the will of her father, and underwent shock therapy and other awful treatments there. They gave her, I believe, this drug called cardio something. I can't remember the exact name, but it would basically like cause intense spasmodic attacks. And Carrington wrote about her time there in her book Down Below. Eventually, though, she made her way to Mexico and became embedded in the European emigre artist community there. Leonora Carrington had a Celtic background on her mother's side and incorporated Celtic legend and imagery into her art, along with the indigenous Mexican imagery. She's known for her culinary experimentation, and she viewed the domestic sphere as a source of magic and female empowerment. And interestingly, in Leonora Carrington's paintings and her fictional writings, such as The Hearing Trumpet, she a lot of times focused on reclaiming the dignity of aging women. And over in recent years, her artwork has sort of seen a revival in popularity as being like feminist and ecological and whatnot.
Well, I was going to talk about Ithell Colquhoun, um, which, she was kind of similar to those two in many respects. Or like Leonora Carrington, she was a British surrealist. And I think what you were saying about the women in the movement having a problem with the influence of Desaad. I mean, some of the surrealists did works of women like figures and that were, pretty like treating women like an object. So I think that some of it was also there as well. Because, these artists were like defying moral conventions and shunning them openly. So I think it kind of led some of the male artists to do work that was, probably not so um, looked at as fondly by the women movement. But yeah,
Well,
like Leonora Carrington, Ithell Colquhoun was another one who was she was very, very interested in the occult, like Remedios Varo and Leonora Carrington. And all of them were, as female artists, they were really underappreciated during their own lifetime. But in recent years, all of them have undergone like a real revival and interest in having their own exhibitions in major museums. Um, and the surrealists, like most art movements at that time, were really male dominated, and a lot of the women didn't get as much attention. But I think in retrospect, I mean, her work, like Varro and Carrington, was on par with any of the male artists at that time. But Ithell Colquhoun was also an occultist and had interest in the esoteric. And hers, I think, actually transcended mere fascination or symbolism. And she was actually a member of the OTO, um, and refused to leave when she was given an ultimatum by the British Surrealist group because they didn't want you to be a member of any other organization. I don't know if it was because she was part of an occult group that they had a problem with, but she didn't want to leave. But despite being ostracized, she continued to work as a self-identified surrealist, and she used the stream of consciousness, automatic techniques described in the manifesto by Breton. That manifesto, it laid out a lot of the, you know, methods that we've already talked about, like including cut ups, rapidly, cutting up words and rapidly reassembling them to make a poem, or surrealist games like the Exquisite Corpse. All of it was to unlock the unconscious mind and create bizarre, like intuitive artistic compositions. But Ithell Colquhoun, she actually invented a method herself called parsimage, where she would use charcoal, uh, you know, powder in water, and then would put paper or canvas and then to leave an impression. It would dip it in the water and lift it up, and it would create an abstract image with the powdering. So she definitely used automatism to channel the unconscious, and her work and like her paintings is very sensual. I mean, some of it almost reminds me of Georgia O'Keeffe in many respects, not just for its sexuality, but its depiction or connection to the natural world. Um, I think a lot of the surrealists had flirtations or interest in Hermeticism and the occult, but I think she took it to the next level in terms of her personal practices and her lifestyle. And I know later on, not only was she in the OTO, but she was initiated in the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So she really, um, her interest in the occult went beyond, uh, mere flirtation. But I think all these artists were working at a time where there was, like I was saying earlier, a real wave of interest in esotericism and the occult in Europe. And I really think a lot of it goes back to industrialization, um, as a reaction to the perceived limitations or failures of uh, modern science. And you had, like I was saying, large industrial cities, uh, and the industrialization. You had this apotheosis of reason and rationality. But what was it producing? It was producing workers slaving away in terrible conditions and uh, industrial scale slaughter in the battlefields of World War One. And so they saw reason and rationality as a failure. And we're looking for an alternative form of emancipation. And I think that led the Surrealists to have an interest in alchemy and magic. Um, and so I think for the same reason, in the Nazis case, um, who it's concurrent. The rise of fascism was happening at the exact same time. Like Max Ernst, Hitler had fought in the German army during World War One. But in the Nazis' case, the fascination with the occult meant returning to this earlier mythic time. Um, I mean, and this is why, it's so funny because Hitler hated modern art and considered the surrealists to be degenerates. I mean, during the degenerate art exhibit in Nazi Germany, he showed Max Ernst's work and the other surrealists. And Nazi Germany, they idealized classical art for its perceived purity. Um, and but I think that there's something real related there in terms of how industrialization brought about a kind of trauma uh, in Europe, where peasants were fleeing to the cities and becoming the industrial proletariat, and artisans saw their social status destroyed by mass production. Their skills were no longer valued, and they were forced to become factory workers like everybody else, working for shit wages and in terrible conditions. In the shift from handcraft to factory production, and you had this power struggle, like in the late 19th century, between the industrialists and financiers, the bourgeoisie, and the aristocracies. Um, and around that same time, the resurgence of the esoteric and occult views became popular among the aristocracy, who were appalled by the multiculturalism and the cosmopolitanism of the cities and the chaos of the modern world. And so all these like proto-fascist secret societies and occultist circles began to proliferate. And a lot of this stuff was popularized by people like Madame Blavatsky, who was this Russian mystic who was an adventurer, claimed to have like telepathic powers and to be clairvoyant. And she was a very influential figure. And, she didn't just have an influence on the German occultists who like did the magazines that like people like Hitler was reading before he became what he later became. But she had a big influence on a lot of artists, including people like Agnes Pelton and so on. But Blavatsky paved the way for a lot of the stuff that came in the next century, including stuff that later happened in the West, like Hare Krishna movement, stuff today, transcendental meditation, Zen Buddhism, yoga, all these fads,
Yeah,
with theosophy.
those are great points you're making about industrialization. And I see it, I guess, the opposite of the surrealists, that instead of it being that reason and rationality failed, I think capitalism, and specifically imperialistic capitalism, failed to be rational and reasonable. And I know, actually, funnily enough, one of the women artists loosely affiliated with the surrealists, or a few of them, I think, but I know specifically Dorothea Tanning. I think she really liked Marquis de Sade and painted a painting, I believe it was called the Petite Marquis, in honor of his birthday. But Remedios Varo, I feel her art's interesting because I feel like she, instead of rejecting modern science, almost incorporates it into her art. And her technique, she's is very exacting and very technical and planned, instead of being like a lot of the surrealists where it was more automatic and spontaneous. Remedios Varo, she was born in Spain and she was in Mexico at the same time as Leonore Carrington was. The two artists are actually very close friends. You can see by looking at their art from that time period how much they really influenced each other. Varo's art was heavily influenced by her interest in Eastern spirituality. She often attended meetings of the followers of the Russian mystics Gurdjieff and Upensky. She also was interested in alchemy, the tarot, and a lot of modern innovations in science, such as space travel. I know she had a lot of, like in her personal library, she had a lot of science fiction and like science magazines about space travel and other.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think she was pretty interested. There was a volcano that I think it was somewhere in Latin America that blew up in that time, and she was very interested in that and read a lot about it. Um, at one point, she joined a French scientific expedition in Venezuela, where she visited her mother and brother Rodrigo, who was an epidemiologist. Her a lot of I think where she got her, or at least was influenced in a lot of her very technical drawings that are in her art. Her father was a hydraulic engineer, and I believe that she spent a lot of time with him. But Varo, she when studied mosquitoes while she was in Venezuela with a microscope, and she actually produced drawings of them for a public Ministry of Health campaign against malaria. In my opinion, her art attained a really it's this interesting synthesis of science and nature, which I feel like are commonly posed as contradictory. But I don't think that it has to be. I think science can work with nature in a symbiotic way and overcome the false contradiction forced between profit-driven science within capitalism, which actually can oftentimes ignore real science and what benefits the natural world and its inhabitants. So to move on, I guess, to the Nazis and their interest in the occult. Now
Yeah,
I oh sorry, do you have something you want to add?
yeah, no, I think it's I think that the what happened with the Nazis and um it's complicated, but at some point, because at the same time that all this was going on, you also had the rise of the eugenics movement. And at some point, the eugenics movement, which started in the United States and Britain, and made its way to Germany, at some point, this revival of interest in the occult and this, what was purporting to be science, but it was a pseudoscience, the eugenics, that merged with this revival in the occult because you had people like Madame Blavatsky and her work, like The Secret Doctrine, it contained theories on human evolution or what was purporting to be building off of, and you also had social Darwinism as a factor as well. Um, but her work contained theories on human evolution and race, and she talked about that there were these mythical ancient races, because linguists at the time, there was this idea that because linguists had observed that a lot of languages like Latin and Sanskrit and so on had a lot in common, they must have all therefore descended from the same ancient language. Um, and at some point, this that idea became that they must have descended from the same distinct race. And in Germany, this took on the assumption that, because one of the races that she talked about were these pure Aryans. And at some point that became white, blonde, blue-eyed specimens, and that they were superior to, not just darker peoples, but also the Jews, the Semites, who were thought to come from a different stock, I guess. And then you also had the rise of nationalism, where these ideas about race were adopted and inspired this, cult idea of like a pure-blooded race, free from the contamination of weaker uh, uh, subhumans. And the Nazis, they they had this idea that like they were going to create this new society based around selective breeding, and therefore over several generations, through this genetic pseudoscience, weed out the impurities. And there was selective breeding, and while lower classes and the inferior races were to be enslaved and sterilized. But the whole Nazi state had this kind of messianic, quality, with Hitler. And at some point, like, this mythology about ancient Aryan peoples merged with uh, esoteric cosmology, because a lot of these German occultists like Jörg Lunds, who did this magazine, I forget what it was called, but Hitler was like an avid reader of it, and that's where he got a lot of these ideas from. That sort of, I mean, I don't know how racist Madame Blavatsky herself was, but either way, these ideas had an influence on these German occultists who were ethno-nationalists and pan-German um, occultists, and they formed this group called the Thule Society, which gave birth to the Nazi Party. It was originally an occultist group.
Yeah,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
I know that a German occultist that was pretty influential for the Nazis was Lanz von Liebenfels. Von Liebenfels argued that the Aryan people were intentionally bred via electricity by interstellar deities called Theozoa, and the other races were the result of humans crossbreeding with ape men. So, see, according to him, because the Aryans ended up interbreeding, that's what robbed them of the magical powers they used to possess. 'Cause I think he said like had telepathy and other supernatural abilities.
Yeah, and that they were going to somehow, by, I think the idea was by creating this state where they had eugenics laws and the Nuremberg race laws, that they would somehow get back to that state where, I guess, that the pure Aryans would be like this next step in evolution, and would have these psychic abilities that they used to have. I mean, it's just crazy talk. But somehow this is how, this convergence between the occult and the eugenics movement and this kind of pseudoscience, all kind of like came together in this like embodiment in the Nazi Party. But I think it can be kind of traced back to the stuff that people like Madame Blavatsky were uh, were preaching. But I think that overall, this sort of um, popularization of, or renewed interest in the occult, came from like the um, yeah, from the advent of industrialization, and leading to um, the uh, mass slaughter of not just World War One, but then later World War Two. Um, but I guess it's really kind of uh, an issue in terms of the fact that, like, people like, not just the way that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union get lumped together by people like Hannah Arendt and Karl Popper, but even later the Frankfurt School, where like it was written as if like, because they sort of shared some of the critiques of rationality and the Enlightenment that the Surrealists had, but they saw, Nazi Germany as this um, apotheosis of the failures of reason and rationality. um, that's what it led to. Um, was the Holocaust, um, without taking into account, like, look how much the Nazi state was based on the occult and not based, it had nothing to do with reason, and that they were bastardizing science, and that they were um, had all kinds of bizarre beliefs. I mean, they led these expeditions in Tibet looking for the bones of ancient Aryans, that they were there somehow, because also Madame Blavatsky, I believe, went on expeditions to Tibet earlier, that's, gave them this idea that this is where the ancient Aryans were. They had bizarre pseudoscientific views about science and evolution, and they was totally related to the occult. I mean, their adoption of occult symbols and symbols from Eastern mysticism, Hindu symbols like the swastika itself, and then, like, the black Nazi black sun, the interlocking swastikas forming. A lot of it had to do with Arthurian legends. I think even like the the castle that Himmler had with the black sun on the floor. It was supposed to represent the Knights of the Round Table. Um, I mean, their whole state was founded on these very bizarre um, beliefs, and that were the total rejection of. I mean, yes, the Nazis were. I mean, this is the real problem I have with it, because yes, the Nazis were a strong state with central planning and all that. That's probably the only overlap that they had with something like the Soviet Union. But they also rejected many aspects of rationality. And
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point because there's so much literature out there now saying that the Nazis and their programs and what they did in the concentration camps was like the pinnacle of scientific rationality, but it was actually a descent and to madness and a rejection of modernity, a descent. A lot of the scientific experimentation they were doing in the concentration camps was actually because they had these occult ideas like, well, if we can get dunk someone into freezing cold water till they freeze to death, like, can we bring them back to life? And this other occultic ideas. And actually, the first Indiana Jones movie with the Nazis hunting for the lost ark, they is
yeah,
not completely fictional. They had some interest in that. I know Himmler himself was a very avid follower of the occult. And actually, a lot of Nazi party members regularly consulted astrologers so as to know what their horoscopes were. Funnily enough, Himmler put together a task force to conduct a secret research program into the history of witches in Germany because Himmler was really interested in witches because he thought that, you know, how witches had been prosecuted in Germany. He thought that if he could find the descendants of witches, they would still have supernatural powers. And that, see, the witches were passing down their supernatural powers. And actually, he pushed for the incorporation of witch dances into Nazi ceremonies. But some prominent occultists who had been imprisoned in the concentration camps are actually released so they could use their supernatural abilities to help the Nazi government. The German Navy attempted to apply divination to locate enemy ships and using dowsers. I found an article, which I'm going to read a quote from. I'll put a link to it. It says, among the German naval officers puzzled by the sudden shift of fortunes in the Battle of the Atlantic was U-boat Captain Hans Roeder. An amateur dowser himself, Roeder was convinced the British were employing similar means to locate U-boats. He suggested that Germany set up its own pendulum institute to develop appropriate countermeasures. Receiving approval for the institute from German naval intelligence in September 1942, Roeder proceeded to recruit a small army of pendulum dowsers, as well as astrologers, astronomers, ballisticians, clairvoyants, and mathematicians, and psychics. Inside the institute, Radi radiesthesiologists would place a tiny tin toy battleship on a larger map of the Atlantic Ocean spread across the table. They would then swing a 1 centimeter metal cube on a short string above the toy ship. If the pendulum reacted, it was supposed to indicate the presence of a real enemy battleship at that location. The laughable experiment failed to produce any meaningful results. I mean, as we can see, then, this was not a society that was some pinnacle of rationality. If they literally, because I mean, the British, they were using sonar and radar technology to locate ships, but the Nazis were like, we're going to use dowsing.
Well, even their ideas, I mean, like their whole there's some scholars who try and say that the over or like the influence of the occult on Nazism was is exaggerated, but I really don't think it was, especially when you look at something like the Volkisch movement, which was the traditionalist, like pan-German movement that led to the Nazi movement, and it was a response to not just industrialization, but like this contempt for city life, like and this idealizing of like farm life specifically. Um, this idealization, hence that where they got that whole idea of blood and soil, and that that their ethno-nationality was somehow inherently tied to the fatherland, and this the ethnic body was like tied, or the body of the people was like tied to uh, organicist, agrarian, um, the land. And I think that if you look at their adoption of all this stuff, yeah, it's not a society based on like the pinnacle of rationality. It's this adoption of all these irrational, unscientific ideas, and that's clearly influenced by uh, mythology and these occult themes, and they. I think that it's a misunderstanding to downplay the significance of that influence and to make this broad sweeping critique of because also the influence of the eugenics movement was something that had come from Western Europe, and not only that, the expansionism that the Nazis did, the uh, attempt to go east and enslave Slavs for the Lebensraum, um, and that they were going to sterilize all them and create this, over several generations, this new race uh, Ubermensch, and you know, it was they got that from Western colonialism, really, if you look at it, and this attempt to by people like Hannah Arendt and Karl Popper and the rest of them to portray the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany as these twin pillars of totalitarianism, and that this is what happens when you get uh, that this is the logical outcome of the failure of the Enlightenment and rationality. I think that the consequence of that is to sever or truncate the legacy of Nazi Germany from um, European colonialism, which had happened under the Kaiser in Germany. I mean, they had done um, committed genocide of tribes and the Herero tribes in Namibia. I mean, this was not this idea that, I mean, yes, what the Nazis did was a very unique form of evil, if you want to call it that, in terms of the extent of the savagery and the industrial scale killing of people by these incredibly cruel and experimental means, um, and all the different methods that they were trying to come up with in these bizarre experiments. But at the end of the day, if anything, it's the highest point or the culmination of the legacy of European colonialism. And so I think that's where this kind of narrative comes. But I do think that part of that is like this kind of downplaying of the extent of um, their bizarre belief system and like what their whole project was all about and the sort of occult roots of it. Um, and where they got their whole ideology from. And it's not to say that like anyone with occult beliefs or that occult beliefs will like inherently lead to what the Nazis did, but it is a very significant factor in their bizarre belief system and how it took shape, in the state that they formed.
Yeah, your points about the history of Western colonialism is it's exactly right. And one of my favorite quotes from Frantz Fanon, he said, he basically, to paraphrase, like, what is fascism but colonialism coming home to roost? Meaning that fascism is is the treatment that colonial populations got coming to those same those colonialist countries and being employed to the population there. And since I think we've gone a few episodes without mentioning Lacerda, I'm just going to say everyone should read War and Revolution by Lacerda, which is a very good book and really refutes a lot of the sort of what I would say bad history, just conflating the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany. But it's interesting. I think um, today you see a sort of rise of interest in the occult and this sort of new age spirituality. But the interesting thing about it to me is a lot of the new age spirituality, it says things like, you can get more money by just manifesting all these. It's very individualistic, and it sort of posits like if you're sick or if you're poor, it's your own fault because you didn't tell the universe what you needed and that you needed money and so on. And you could see how that sort of new age belief could lead to something, or at least more fascistic, or at least something very rapaciously capitalist. One thing I forgot to add about the Nazis' interest in witches, I believe when the Red Army was pushing back, the Nazis, I can't remember where, but they ended up coming to a castle that the Nazis had been using, and they found a lot of documents, and they were really excited because, all this Nazi intelligence. But the documents weren't Nazi intelligence. It was all this data and papers and documents collected about witches and the history of witches,
Was
which
this the Wavelsberg castle that Himmler?
I think so.
Yeah, I think that I've seen a lot of people. I tried to read some of the accounts of people who dismiss the influence of the occult on Nazi Germany. And the argument that they try and make is that, oh, well, this idea that there was like that what inspired them was like this hidden truth behind reality. And like that's the dangerous kind of thinking that led to them taking power in the first place. Um, and I just disagree with that because it's the reverse, that's sort of what led them to have their beliefs was this idea of, this seeking beyond, you know, this quest for otherworldly forces, um, you know, that that's what their whole project was, these esoteric ideas was based on. Um, and I think that like to give it just this simple uh explanation is an attempt to tie, to downplay that is to kind of tie Nazism to um like the danger of having a society based on rationality and reason when they're like if you look at the things that led to the Nazi Party, not just um the Thule or the Volkisch movement, but like the Thule Society, which was the occult group, their ideas about ancestral heritage, which came from the eugenics movement, and then like Himmler's castle, all this like uncanny phenomena that's clearly was a very big part of their belief system. I think it's sort of the downplaying of that stuff is like sort of gets into the debate of how the fascism arose and how much of it was based on this stuff, because it was directly tied to their racism and these ideas about biological superiority. And to dismiss that stuff is because there's this real concerted effort to just see them as this to sever their legacy from things that had begun in Western Europe and to sort of it's the same way with it, they're rewriting history about leveling the blame for the war itself equally at the foot of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, like that it was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that was actually the starting point in the war. You had like these European Union resolutions a few years ago that were going back and rewriting that history. They even though it was the Soviet Union that did the most to defeat Nazi Germany in the first place, and that their armaments had come from the violation of the Treaty of Versailles, Wall Street, and these Western countries allowing Germany to refurbish their arms and because they wanted to use them to attack the USSR. They had all formed pacts with Hitler before uh, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But I think that somewhere in this sort of like dismissal of the significance of the occult on the Nazis is somehow related to that, because they have this idea that the Nazis were like this culmination of how like science can be abused and or that and it was abused, but that it's somehow that the Nazi Germany as a totalitarian state was like this highest point of organizing a society around reason and rationality, which is, I think, the furthest thing from the truth. And if you look at their ideas and where it came from, um, and the way that the like even their ranks, like the Thule Society and the uh, the way that within the aristocracy, all these secret societies had formed based on occultism and based on these like racist ideas. And when you look at Madame Blavatsky's writings, the way that she's talking about these um, these ancient mythical races, and that the reason for the cosmopolitanism and the multiculturalism and uh, all these things that they had disdain for in the big urban cities in Europe, that it was because the bloodline had been contaminated, and that over time, the pure Aryans they had intermixed with these subhuman races, and there was only one way to get back to that, and just these bizarre ideas in their beliefs. And yeah, I think that it's a very significant factor in their ideology, and it's one that unfortunately has not gotten as much attention as it should. I mean, the links between the occult and fascism, for sure.
Yeah, and I think one of the Nazi officials that didn't, I don't think he actually believed in the occult, but rather viewed it as an effective propaganda tool to control the masses was Goebbels.
Hmm.
Apparently, they wanted to, I think they believed they started printing horoscopes um, with the intention of manipulating the public opinion in Germany because a lot of people at that time apparently, consulted their horoscopes. Goebbels realized the way in which astrology could be an effective propaganda tool, and he even wrote in his diary, quote, "The whole world is full of mystical superstition. Why shouldn't we exploit that in order to undermine the enemy front?" Close quote. But not to use an ad hominem abusive argument, but if you just watch a clip of Hitler giving a speech, he does not seem like the culmination of a rational man to me. And there's lots of, and just,
Yeah, I mean, this whole voodoo science that they adopted, um, I mean, in their propaganda and their, their pecking order and how, their, uh, where people had to be in the SS, you had to like prove your bloodline going back over 100 years, these ideas about racial purity. Yes, this stuff was posing itself as science, but it had come from, I mean, the eugenics movement had been born in the United States and Britain, and it was spread to Germany. Um, so yes, there was abuse of science, um, and but to blame that, I mean, to see it as this failure of rationality and the Enlightenment overall, I think is I think that these people were, I mean, in regard to like the Surrealists, I mean, you can understand why they felt that way, and they were searching for a higher truth, or they were rebelling against that in their, you know, the transgression of their art. But I think, yeah, I mean, I just think it's incredibly interesting that like that the Surrealists were themselves interested and influenced by the occult, but then so were the Nazis, and then they had, you know, in the degenerate art exhibit, there were, the Surrealists were considered the most degenerate, I think. Um, so it was just kind of an interesting irony there. But then you had someone like Dali, who actually saw the Nazis as almost like, I think he actually, in one of his letters with Bertani, even said he thought that the Nazi Germany was a surrealist state. It's just kind of interesting that, but the fact that this was all happening in the same time period, I think is really fascinating. And there's some sort of interesting connections there. Um, but yeah, I think this was an interesting discussion about.
yeah, I'm just going to make my final thought is I think that the First World War was kind of an explosion of the contradictions of imperialist capitalism. And it was, and sort of revealed that capitalism, as much as it purports to be, isn't actually a rational or reasonable society by any means. But it became, instead, I think the sort of general view became that rationality itself was at fault, instead of that it was a fake, or that rationality was being posited while society itself was structured in a rational way, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Do you have any final thoughts?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that you know, I think that there there's a lot of people that think that are like under the impression that, like, for example, Nazi Germany was like maybe like a Christian country, but if you look at their beliefs, it's pretty clear that it was only nominally Christian, and a lot of their ideas actually were very, um, I mean, if you look at them, like a lot of these pan-German ethno-nationalist ideas were very much actually harkening back to paganist, or like not just a cult, but even anti-Christian ideas that were motivating them. Um, so that's not to say that that every German soldier in the Nazi party had these beliefs, but the leadership of the party and these people that were, formulated the ideology of the movement, and there was clearly like a very strong influence of occultism. But in relations to the surrealists, and what we were talking about earlier with these artists that were also interested or influenced by the occult, I think again the real root causes that can go back to this is, or that stem from this is the advent of industrialization and the horrors of the First World War and the sort of crisis within capitalism that led people from various walks of life to have this yearning for the esoteric and the resurgence of interest in those kind of subjects. I think that that's kind of where that all comes from, and the fact that there was this crisis within in the transition from feudalism to capitalism and industrialization, and the rise of eugenics and nationalism, and that tied in with this interest in the occult. But with the surrealists, it was sort of a their reasons for getting into it were very, very distinct from the Nazis, but at the same time there is some kind of linkage there as far as the historical circumstances in which they were living and everything that was happening in world events at the time.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we'll be back again
Well,
soon. Oh,
one
sorry.
thing,
Yeah, go
just
ahead.
remind everybody, follow us on X. It's Captive Minds X, and if our YouTube channel, hit like and subscribe, or on Substack, hit like and comment and subscribe and all that. That's it.
Yes, and thank you for listening to the only podcast where you'll hear about the Nazis, occultism, and then our previous episodes about, for example, how much Bernie Sanders has failed and sucks. So thank you for listening. We'll be back.